glimpses of the holy and shreds of the sacred. Indeed. I have a friend. He's incarcerated in federal prison, half a continent away, serving 5 years. We communicate regularly by special email through the Department of Corrections. I told him last week the title of my remarks for this morning. I got a response back Thursday, and I want to read that to you. He said, "I love that phrase, glimpses of the holy and shreds of the sacred. That is what I continue to be graced with here. Each day I spend an hour in a Rosetta Stone course continuing my Spanish lessons. I sit next to an Hispanic inmate who is using a Rosetta Stone course to learn English, about the same level that I am learning Spanish. I'm responding to the computer program, and it is inevitable that I overhear his attempts at English as he must hear my attempts to speak Spanish." And then he says this: "There seems to be an invisible bridge between us being built for that hour of each day as we both struggle to learn the language of the other. And all the learning the language can open up for both of us, a kind of childhood parallel play perhaps, which helps each of us grow." My friend is one of over 1,200,000 men and women and juveniles who are incarcerated in our prisons, our jails, our juvenile detention centers. And every time I write my friend, I am reminded of the first of our purposes and principles: the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and that includes my friend and all of his colleagues who are incarcerated. Several years ago, one of my colleagues, Reverend Morrison Reed, came to preach here. Just before the sermon started, I rushed down and I whispered in his ear. And I told him, I said, "Your one reading in our gray hymnal is the most important reading in the whole book. And the first line of your one reading is the most important line in the whole 300-page book." He started crying. I started crying, and we hugged. And Reverend McCarr, he was standing somewhere nearby. He thought I was stepping on his guest minister's foot or something, because his guest minister was crying, so he came rushing up to see what was going on. But I think really what was going on, and the reason we cried, is because we both knew that that first line was probably the only sermon that either one of us had, and that all of our other sermons in our whole lives were variations on a theme. That is, the primary task of the religious community is to unveil the bonds that bind each to the other. We didn't discuss our thoughts on how do you do that? Well, my answer to that, and of course that must be answered if you're going to, if that sentence is so important, it's going to be lived out, you've got to have some answers to how you're going to do that. And I'm here this morning to tell you that my opinion is that one of the answers is by the sharing of stories. The sharing of stories that, that give us some indication of who we are. And only by the sharing of stories can we unveil those bonds. We can't discover the bonds if we don't share the stories. Here's a fine musician here. I know he's a musician, but that's not enough. We need to share stories if we're going to really get to know each other. If we're going to unveil the bonds that bind him to me, then we have to share something about ourselves. Not just the fact that he's a musician or that she marches in marches that are important to her in a social justice cause, but we have to share stories that are real, that make us vulnerable, and it's only then that we get real honest with each other. And only then can we unveil those bonds. I want to tell you a few stories this morning out of my long journey in ministry that have shaped who I am, and stories that I will only hint at. And the phrase shreds of the sacred have to do with my memory. I'm going on 79 years old, and I don't guarantee anything. I don't even guarantee that everything I tell you will be true. But I will tell you that I used to be, some of you know this, I used to be a country circuit riding lay Unitarian Universalist preacher. For 13 years, I served 5 little Universalist churches in 3 states. And I was gone every weekend. And Nancy Bartley would often go with me and play her guitar. And Michelle and Anne-Marie, two of my 3 daughters, would often go and play their flute and clarinet. And there's a famous line of a Universalist preacher of 100 years ago. He wrote a book called My 47 Years in the Ministry. And he talked about riding his horse, like from Newberry, South Carolina to Winder, Georgia. Sometimes in a storm, in the rain, and the congregation may have to wait a long time because he may be delayed in his horse. But when he climbed up into the pulpit, he had a famous saying. He said, "I've come a long way, and I'm going to preach for a long time." And so you laugh, but you know, if I'm a part of him, you no telling how long this gathering is going to last. So you better just be prepared. I know there are children in there in their religious education program. If this runs over, they'll just have to come in here, and we'll see what happens. When I first went to the first of the little country churches, I was terrified. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what they were going to expect. Anyway, I began my sermon with my dry mouth and being frightened. And about 5 minutes into my sermon, I noticed out of the corner of my eye there was an elderly lady sitting on the front row, and she was nodding in agreement with me. I was so thrilled. It gave me a sense of confidence. And I galloped on for another 10 minutes. And then I noticed she was still nodding. And then it suddenly occurred to me that she was not nodding in agreement with me. She was nodding because she had an affliction. But it gave me such a boost of confidence that it didn't matter that it was real or not. I continued on, and she taught me how fragile our feelings and egos are sometimes, and I was able to laugh at myself in my own frailties. And that was fine until, I began to see this was, these little churches had no air conditioning. The windows had to be open. The doors had to be open. Bees and wasps would come and bang themselves up against the ceiling. I'm not sure why. One day, I was in the middle of my sermon, and a neighborhood dog came walking in. And he sat down I could only believe that my reputation as a preacher had spread throughout the neighborhood. And he had come to hear this new minister. And that was just fine, and I loved that. And I appreciated his coming. But then out of the corner of my eye this time, not the old lady, but the dog, he yawned. He yawned, and then he got up and walked out. Right in the middle of my sermon. Hurt my feelings, he did. But he also taught me a lesson. The world doesn't revolve around me. That was a pretty good lesson from a dog. Many of you will remember Reverend Martha Griffith. She was my internship supervisor here when I did my internship in this congregation in 1992. She was a dear friend. She was a fine and honorable minister. And I could not stand before you today without lifting up some words of hers. Reverend Griffith, for those you don't know, you may not know her, she was the associate minister here in 1992. I invited her to do the ordination sermon when this congregation ordained me. The title of her sermon was, "I've come a long way and I'm going to preach a long time." And I think she scared the hell out of everybody there. Because it was about a three-hour sermon. I don't know. 3 months after delivering that sermon, she was in New Orleans on vacation with a friend, the minister in New Orleans, and she was diagnosed with lymphoma. And 9 months later, she was dead at age 39. She was hospitalized in New Orleans. That congregation and her friend took care of her. She kept a diary, a journal. And I want to read to you just a couple of lines. And these lines were actually published in the UUCA newsletter in May of 1994, about a month after Reverend Griffith died. And these are her words, written on December the 15th, 1993. "I'm determined to go on a walking tour of the French Quarter tonight. I'll take my cane. I'll crawl if I have to. I need to see some sparkle and beauty of Christmas." And on February the 4th, 94, she wrote, "Bare winter tree branches catch the gaudy Mardi Gras beads missed by the crowd's hands. They hang there now, colorful and rain-soaked, where they will hang for years, a testament to the human need to play in the midst of winter, a testament to the transience of things, of joy and sorrow." And her last entry on February the 16th, 94. "My faith, Unitarian Universalism, is no fair weather faith. Ask me, I've tested it. I know." She died in April of that year. She taught me about dying with dignity, with grace, and the courage to accept the inevitable. I miss her still. When I was ordained here, I shortly after that was called to a congregation in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And at one point in my ministry there, I went to visit about a dozen Unitarian Universalists who lived in a life care facility. I took with me a book of short stories, and I invited them to read a common short story and come back the following week with a one-page, not a summary of the story, but a written recollection of your engagement with the story as you read it. They came. They came back the following week. They came in their wheelchairs. They came with their hearing aids. They came with their trimmers. They came with their knowledge that death was not too far away. They were eager to share. And they shared not a summary of the story, but their engagement with it, which meant that they were sharing parts of themselves. They were using that short story to offer a glimpse into their soul to their friends who were sitting around the table. And this was no intellectual gathering. When each person finished their sharing, their one-page sharing, the group said, "Thank you." And we moved on to the next one. And as I watched all of that unfold, I realized how important it is that we tell stories to each other, that we allow others to glimpse who we are. I've often used the imagery of a prism. You know, we know each other only through what the person has told us and what we've observed. And it's almost like when we stand and we look at a prism, we see parts of the rainbow. And the person over there may see a different sequence of colors because of where they're standing. And it's similar with us. People know us by the stories that we tell. And everybody in this room knows some people here, but you know them only through the prism of the stories that they have shared with you. And so really my hope today is that my words can somehow invite and motivate you to find new ways to share with each other, to find new ways to share with people you have not yet met and you don't yet know in this community. So that's my mission this morning, is to invite all of that to come about. For 6 months, I was a chaplain in the neuropsychiatric unit of the geriatric hospital at Wesley Woods, part of Emory. Now, this was a 30-day diagnostic facility trying to figure out how to best help folks who had various forms of dementia and Alzheimer's. And to send a Unitarian Universalist into that setting was the best thing they could have done. Absolutely, because all the labels of I'm a Jew, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Unitarian Universalist, I'm a Presbyterian, all of that stuff drops to the wayside at the door, okay? Many of these people, number one, didn't know even where they were or where their families were, but they all had deep human yearnings that were very much the same. And I had to figure out how to do ministry with them. One of the things we did, every time we gathered for worship, I would bring some object that would stimulate, hopefully, one of the five senses. I might bring a seashell. And if you can picture a 90-year-old lady listening to a seashell with a group gathered around her, you know what happens next? She starts telling what? A story about walking on the beach with her mama. Okay? All because of a seashell. She honors the gathering by telling her story, and the group honors her by listening to her story. They had not heard that story before, but it was called forth by a seashell and a preacher who was desperate, who didn't know what else to do. You sure couldn't go in there with a Bible, I'll tell you that. Again, stories. You hear what I'm saying? Stories. When I was a minister in Macon, I was on the executive committee of the NAACP. We gathered in a neighborhood one Saturday morning just to go house to house in teams of 2. Just hello, how are you? Meet your neighbor, meet and greet, encourage you to do something nice for your neighbor before the sun goes down that day. That's all it was. So we knocked on the first door. A grandmother was raising two teenage boys. And as we left, she said, now the lady next door, she can't hear and she can't speak. And so my buddy and I, we decided that it would be the best thing to do is kind of skip over that house. We didn't know what to do. And so we're halfway passing her home. And we hear behind us this noise, grrr, grrr. And we turned around, and it was a lady who lived there. She couldn't speak, but she could sure growl. And we turned around. We went into her home. The first thing she did, she went and got an order of service from her husband's funeral that was held just 2 months ago. And she made a universal sign of some kind to let us know that her heart was broken. And I spoke it. I said, your heart is broken. And she nodded. And then she went and got a certificate where she had been honored for working for the last 20 years at the Okmulgee Indian Mounds in Macon. And then she took us to a painting around the corner in her home. And it was a painting. It was a field of ripe cotton. And there was a black woman picking cotton. And I don't know how she did it, but she, with her, I guess, motions, she was telling us a story. And the story was that she, as a little girl, used to pick cotton. And so we would mime what she was telling us. She would, yes, that's it. She would pick the cotton. She would put it into the bag, and we'd have a bag right there. And then she'd pull it down the row. And that's how she told us the story. And my friend and I, when we left, we went back to the car. We couldn't go in any other houses right then. We went back to the car and cried. She taught us, or the message she sent was, don't pass me by. Don't pass me by just because I'm different. Don't pass me by just because you're afraid to be near differentness. That's a powerful learning for a young preacher. I pass that along to you, too. There was a woman in Atlanta who contacted me she had been assaulted and robbed downtown near a MARTA station. The fellow was caught and arrested, and he was in prison. And she wanted to forgive him, and she wanted me to help her. Wanted me to see what I could do to be helpful to him. And so I wrote to him, and I asked if he would be interested in being friends. And he wrote me back, and he said he would be honored to be friends, and he would try his very best to do that. He said he hadn't had any visits in the 21 months he'd been there, and that he would welcome a visit especially. And then he said, I'm in the mental health unit. I'm schizophrenic. I'm not harmful. I'm just not very trustful of people. And I'm not able to think about the future very much. He said, I've been in and out of foster homes all of my life. And I would welcome your friendship. Well, I went to see him. He was frightened when I told him that the woman that he assaulted had sent me to befriend him. He thought I had come to harm him. He couldn't believe that someone who had been assaulted would send someone to befriend him. And we sat in a gymnasium, locked in with other inmates and their families and visitors, 25 or 30 of them. The sign on the wall. You know what the sign says? The sign says, no hugging, except at the beginning and the end. In the middle of his letter to me, he said, please accept me as I am. I'll never forget it. Please accept me as I am. I'm going to tell you one more. I was a chaplain at Grady Hospital. About 11 o'clock one night, I was walking in a fairly dark corridor in Grady, ready to go home, tired, preoccupied. And I heard a voice. And the voice said, Chaplain, are you saved? Well, I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't know what to do with that. But, I was trying to do right, and so I followed the voice into the darkness, and I sat down and tried to begin having a theological conversation, for God's sake, with her. As I look back on it now, I said, my God, I must have been crazy. But anyway, that's what I tried to do. And I could tell I was failing to communicate and connect. Her eyes glazed over, and soon she said, I got to go. And she left. The next morning, I was telling my supervisor about the incident, and she listened carefully. And then she smiled. And then she laughed at me. And then she said, Rhett, didn't you know she was just trying to connect with you? No, it never occurred to me. It never occurred to me she was just trying to connect with me. She left in the darkness. I never knew her name. I never knew why she was sitting there in the darkness. But all I knew is I didn't connect. I've often thought of her over the years, and I've decided that if I had a chance to do it again, and I heard that voice in the darkness, and somebody said, Chaplain, are you saved? I've got an answer for her this time. And my answer this time would be, yes, ma'am, I am. And how is it with you today? And then guess what? She would tell me a story, right, of why she was there. She didn't really want an answer to that question. She really wanted to connect with another human being. And I learned from that as well. So I hope that if in this community or anywhere else somebody says to you, brother, are you saved? I hope you'll say, what? Yes, sir, I am. Absolutely. And then you say, how is it with you today? And I'll guarantee you, you'll get a story. Okay. Now, we want to move now into the final portion of my sermon that's not printed in your sermon. But at this point in the service, I'd like to ask the volunteer readers to come forward and prepare to participate. And I would invite the ushers to prepare to distribute the gift of a scroll that I have prepared and brought for each of you. So the scroll that's going to be given out is sort of a reverse offertory. So you're not asked to put something in, you're asked to take something out. Okay, but don't open it. Take it out. Each scroll is a copy of one of 60 different pastors' columns that were published, that I wrote and were published in the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, the state newspaper in Arkansas, and the Macon Telegraph, and maybe one or two other newspapers. And it's my hope that you'll take this gift home. Don't even open it now. It's more important that you be present with each other while we have the opportunity this morning and during the coffee hour to be present with each other, not reading a scroll. But take it home with you, and if you're so inclined, read it. And if you're further inclined, bring it back sometime, maybe next week, and seek out somebody in this community that you don't know very well, or that you would like to get to know better, maybe a total stranger, and approach them and use this scroll, use this column, and your response to it as an opportunity, as a bridge to tell that person about what you've read. And maybe they'll tell you about one they've read. There's 60 different columns, so this could be a year-long project. You could trade these off like kids did years ago with baseball cards or whatever, 2 for 1 and bargain and things like that. Okay? You could do this all year long. You could have a different story every week to connect with somebody. So, anyway, I would like to now invite the gifts to be given and the words to be shared. And the words that you're going to hear were collected, crafted by me, and we've recruited 6 readers. And they're just words, and they're going to read them while the scrolls are being distributed. And it's my hope that when you hear these diverse words, that you're going to hear a few that are going to what? They're going to call for stories from deep inside of you. And you're going to say, oh my God. And a story is going to come rolling into your head, into your wherever, consciousness or whatever. And I hope that you will consider going home and writing a 1-page story based on that 1 or 2 words that you have heard. And maybe if you do that, maybe you will share that written story with somebody who loves you, or maybe bring it back and share it with somebody here. Anyway, that's my big pitch for stories, because I think it is so very important. So now we'll hear the words, and we'll have the scrolls, and we'll go from there. Thank you very much, readers.
I am acquainted with being a friend. I am acquainted with the meaning of neighbor. I am acquainted with shame.
I am acquainted with inclusion. I am acquainted with oppression. I am acquainted with integrity.
I am acquainted with reconciliation. I am acquainted with pride. I am acquainted with thanksgiving.
I am acquainted with justice. I am acquainted with anger. I am acquainted with love.
I am acquainted with playfulness. I am acquainted with loneliness. I am acquainted with generosity.
I am acquainted with wholeness. I am acquainted with meanness. I am acquainted with empathy.
I am acquainted with awe and wonder. I'm acquainted with injustice. I am acquainted with blessings.
I am acquainted with laughter. I am acquainted with marginalization. I am acquainted with humility.
I am acquainted with discrimination. I am acquainted with timidity. I am acquainted with boldness.
I am acquainted with mercy. I am acquainted with depression. I am acquainted with joy.
I am acquainted with acceptance. I am acquainted with loss. I am acquainted with imagination.
I am acquainted with courage. I am acquainted with regret. I am acquainted with gratitude.
Thank you, all the readers.
Thank you. As we pause for a moment of silence to reflect on the experience of the morning, especially the invitations to share with others the stories out of your life experiences, I invite you just to sit with the experience that you have had this morning. We see the beautiful colors of the rainbow as the light passes through a prism, depending on where we stand. But we come to see the beauty and the depths of each other by the stories that are shared. May we discover the power of our stories to bless, to affirm, to connect, to allow ourselves to be vulnerable, to make stronger the human bonds of community and commitment to love and justice. We'll now have the closing hymn. Thank you.
Join me in thanking Rhett. So fantastic to have you here. Thank you. As well, Shauna McLeod, so good.